So here's the list of representative heroes for today's lecture. Pharaoh Khufu is the builder of the Great Pyramid, and we'll hear about him today. And it certainly is one of the most amazing things ever constructed. Keep in mind now that Egyptian names have to be transliterated. That is, we have to try to find what combination of Latin letters is equivalent in sound to the hieroglyphics in which these names were originally written, and scholars don't always see eye to eye on this. Also, you'll occasionally run into the Greek form of the Egyptian, Cheops, for example, in the case of Khufu, and this can make using indexes and sources difficult. We'll hear more about this later. Also, there's not complete unanimity about dates either, especially for the earlier pharaohs, so keep that in mind. RC means reigned about. Pharaoh Yunus is not especially important as a ruler, but his pyramid contains what is often said to be the oldest real written literature in the world, the pyramid texts, so we'll hear about them. Around 2150 BC, what historians call the first intermediate period began, during which there was no clear central authority, until around 2060 when Mentuhotep II reestablished order and began what is called the Middle Kingdom, which is much less famous for its accomplishments than the Old Kingdom before it, or the New Kingdom after it. Hatshepsut is one of the most famous of the New Kingdom rulers, in part because she was a woman. Her stepson, Thutmose III, is the first great Egyptian conqueror, the Napoleon of Egypt, as James Henry Breasted calls him, and Amenhotep III is one of the great builders of the New Kingdom, and is sometimes called Amenhotep the Magnificent. Okay then, that's the program for today in a nutshell. This is Giza now, and these are the pyramids there. Last time we saw several important pyramids, but these at Giza are the default pyramids. When pyramids are mentioned without qualification, these are the ones you're supposed to think of. Amazingly, they are not mentioned or pictured in any surviving source before the 5th century BC, 2,000 years after they were built. And then it's a Greek tourist, Herodotus, not an Egyptian, who writes about them. He says that it took 100,000 slaves 20 years to build the Great Pyramid. This does not seem intrinsically unlikely, but considering that his sources also told him that one of the 3 smaller pyramids also at Giza was built by Pharaoh's daughter, who required a stone for it from each of her lovers, and that it probably has at least 10,000 stones in it, we should probably feel free, I think, just to make up our own numbers here. Modern historians think that the time frame is about right, but think a smaller workforce was involved, made up not of slaves, but of workers who may, according to the most sanguine supposition, have gotten some satisfaction themselves from what they were achieving. It's popular now to see the Great Pyramid, and it's the one on the right here, as something in which the whole country took pride, according to what one might regard as kind of the trickle-down theory of glory. Apropos of this, the English archaeologist Flinders Petrie argued that you can't whip people into being technicians. And the Great Pyramid, as he put it, was built with the skill of a jeweler on a scale of acres. We can't picture Bill Gates standing over people at Microsoft, cracking a whip and yelling, "Make that software faster, you dirty geeks." I do think, however, that some of the fellows who just had the job of dragging the stones around might have occasionally preferred to be doing something else, even if they weren't slaves in the usual sense. This is a view of the Great Pyramid by itself now. It was constructed from 2.5 million 2.5-ton blocks of limestone, plus a dozen or so 70-ton blocks in the burial chamber some 200 feet off the ground. The exterior was also covered with finer quality casing stones like those which survive at the very top of Cafre's pyramid next to Khufu's. Herodotus says the exterior was covered with inscriptions, but he was told that they just related to what the workers were fed. This is bizarre even for Egypt, the land of the bizarre. I can only think Herodotus misunderstood his guides. As far as we can tell, the ancient Egyptians had few metal tools harder than copper, although copper can be made very hard. They had no iron at this time, apparently, and little, if any, bronze. They did not have any of the machinery one would think necessary for this kind of thing, apparently not even the wheel. The usual view is that their primary tools were made from harder stones, and they used sleds to drag things over lubricated surfaces. This is all truly hard to believe. Here's a close-up of the Great Pyramid with a randomly chosen tourist to give you some sense of scale on the blocks. Herodotus says they used levers of some sort to raise the stones, but he's not precise, and modern attempts to use various levers and jacks have gotten nowhere. The usual view now is that the stones were elevated by being dragged up a kind of long wraparound ramp. Other theories, some truly strange, have been proposed. One fellow has argued that the blocks were actually cast like cement in molds at the various levels. Another has tried to prove that they used wind power with giant kite-like sails to hoist the blocks. The attempts to try this out should be shown on Archaeology's Funniest Home Videos, I think. I'm inclined to think that they may actually have had pulleys, or at least wheels of some sort. The wheel was being used by this time in Mesopotamia, and we know Egyptians were going there. It looks like someone would have come back and said, "Guess what I saw?" Also, just because there aren't pictures of pulleys, we shouldn't automatically conclude they didn't exist. By parity of reasoning, because there are no pictures of pyramids for 2,000 years, we'd have to conclude they didn't exist either. The cases aren't quite the same, I agree, but if a block and tackle are found in the workers' quarters Mark Lehner's digging up, I won't be surprised. But even if they had the wheel, even if they had pulleys, it's not as though one would be inclined to then say, oh, they had the wheel. The Great Pyramid isn't such a big deal after all. It would still be a nearly unbelievable achievement. This is another view of the Great Pyramid now. When reasonably exact measurements of the Great Pyramid were made in the 19th century, the Englishman John Taylor discovered that the height of the Great Pyramid stands to its circumference as the radius of a circle with the same dimensions would stand to its circumference. That is, if you multiply the height, 481 feet, by 2 pi, 6.28, you get 3,021, and the exact circumference, as it were, is 754 times 4 equals 3,016, though measurements of the circumference vary somewhat. This is thought to be too close for coincidence by many. But a few years ago, in a book called The Riddle of the Pyramids, Kurt Mendelsohn suggested a novel theory to account for it. He thinks the Egyptians used a kind of rolling measuring rod, 1 cubit, 52 centimeters in diameter. I might just say parenthetically that a cubit was supposed to be the length from a man's elbow to his fingertip, fingers outstretched, with fingers outstretched. My arm's a perfect cubit, 52 centimeters, but I'm close to a foot taller than the average Egyptian was. It would seem that their arms must have practically dragged on the ground. All I can think of is that they measured the arms of men who'd been pulling 2.5-ton blocks uphill all day. Anyway, for every circumference of this which they rolled, they raised the height 4 diameters. In this way, the builders could have arrived at a pyramid of the dimensions we have without knowing what pi was at all. Its inclusion, and there's no doubt it's there, would have thus been the result of an accident. There are problems with this theory. For one thing, it does imply the Egyptians had wheels and knew at least one use for them. Also, the other pyramids don't come nearly as close to embodying pi, which seems to imply the roller rod was only used for this pyramid, which seems odd. The Great Pyramid, seen from another angle here now, embodies not only pi, but another interesting number called phi, or the golden section, or the golden proportion, the golden ratio. It can be derived in various ways, but its numerical value is 1.618, more or less. Now the apothem, the distance down the middle of a side of the Great Pyramid, 185 meters, stands to half its base, 115 meters, almost as phi does to 1. The other pyramids, in fact, come closer to embodying this than they do to embodying pi. This relationship, 1.618 to 1, has in fact been used again and again in history in the Parthenon, the Cathedral of Chartres, Leonardo da Vinci talks about it, and so on, and it's thought to create an especially harmonious appearance. It's hard to believe the Egyptians really knew what they were doing here, but it's perhaps even harder to believe that both these numbers got into the Great Pyramid by accident or coincidence. The first record of anyone entering the Great Pyramid comes from the 9th century, when a fellow named Al-Mamun managed it. But he found it empty of any hoped-for treasure and without any body anywhere. If, however, it was entered before his time, there is no certain evidence to establish this, save the emptiness of the thing itself. Tourists now use the passage opened first by Al-Mamun. The official entrance, if we can call it that, although it was certainly never anything like a public entrance, is above it. Presumably Pharaoh's body was taken into the pyramid through it, and it was then sealed and covered over. Here's a cross-section now of the Great Pyramid. Al-Mamun hit the descending passage and found his way up the ascending passage, blocked by plug stones that you can probably just barely make out there, that were placed by people who stayed in the pyramid after Pharaoh's burial to secure the place. It would have been difficult to get volunteers for this job without the escape route there that you see, that comes down from the Grand Gallery to the descending passage. Al-Mamun apparently did not find the escape tunnel, and so had to dig around the plug stones in the ascending passage to get into the Grand Gallery and eventually the presumed tomb chamber that way. This is by far the most complex interior in any pyramid and has produced its own puzzles. What were the other chambers for? Was one for the queen? That's been suggested. Maybe. What was the Grand Gallery for? How did they get 70-ton blocks of granite? That's about what a locomotive weighs, 20 stories off the ground, and into position as relieving stones above the supposed tomb chamber. And what were these relieving stones really for? The Egyptians, it seems, must have known that they really weren't necessary for structural purposes. They're not typically used in other burial chambers beneath or at the bottom of other pyramids. This is the Grand Gallery now, seen from the inside. This is 153 feet long and 25 feet high and has puzzled scholars as much as anything in Egypt. It's been suggested that it might have served as a sort of astronomical sighting device before the pyramid was finished, for example, and it's been argued that it may have served in some way to help raise the heavy stones that were placed over the burial chamber. West says that being in it makes him feel like he's in some kind of instrument. Again, no other pyramid has a feature that resembles this gallery at all closely. The burial chamber looks pretty much as it did when Al-Mamun saw it. The sarcophagus is actually too big to get through the doors, so it had to have been in place before the upper part of the pyramid was finished. No lid was found, nor any body, which is puzzling. We can understand breaking the lid to get into the sarcophagus on the assumption that Pharaoh might have been buried with the family jewels, but would tomb robbers, a class of people not known for being tidy, have then gone to the trouble of dragging the pieces of the lid out of the pyramid? If they were gold, maybe, but no other sarcophagus has ever been found with a valuable lid. The burial chamber was also apparently constructed with the phi or phi proportion in mind. Here is the sarcophagus up closer now, and how was it hollowed out? Some profess to see evidence of the use of some kind of rotary machine on the walls, maybe some kind of jewel-tipped bow-powered drill was used. Who knows? The fact that it's so hard to believe the Egyptians accomplished what we see with the tools we think they had has led some to think it was all done by people from another planet. But you don't throw out something that's hard to believe for something that's impossible to believe. Some people act as though to propose a theory that doesn't contradict itself means we should take it seriously. And what we get then is not an archaeological problem, but a logical one. And need I really say that just to claim a theory doesn't contradict itself is not really to say very much in its favor? I don't contradict myself if I say this was used to store dog biscuits. Here's Giza from a distance again. The Egyptians focused, probably more than almost any people in history, on the eternal. Virtually all of their most impressive art, including the pyramids, seems at least to be devoted either to the hope of a life after death or to making things that will be physically eternal on earth. They wanted to last forever, and they wanted to make things that would last forever, and to succeed at the latter is, well, to the extent that they did anyway, is certainly to some extent to succeed at the former also. Noticed an odd-shaped building beside the Great Pyramid in some of the pictures we've seen. It now houses the boat that was discovered buried next to the pyramid in 1955. As thoroughly as the Giza Plateau had been explored by the 1950s, it's amazing to think that this could still be discovered there so recently. And of course, other important finds in the area have been made since. It is likely that this is the boat that brought Khufu to Giza from Memphis and was then ceremonially buried, perhaps to be used in the next life, perhaps simply to give it a distinguished last resting place as well, since it could hardly be put to ordinary use, hauling bananas up and down the Nile or something like that after carrying the body of Pharaoh. Boats play a prominent part in the Egyptian myth and symbolism too. Ra carries the sun in a boat, and it is the symbol for unity and hieroglyphics. This boat was found disassembled in the form of a kit in 500 pieces with no instructions, and it took archaeologists 10 years to put it together again. Here's the cabin up closer now. This is in by far the best shape of any such boats that have been found. It's cedar, but the others have been cedar too. Its fine state of preservation probably has more to do with an effective seal having been created around it. There is another boat too buried next to Khufu's pyramid, the Great Pyramid, which is puzzling. In any case, it's in poor condition and has not yet been excavated. John Anthony West says that this boat is more seaworthy than anything Columbus had. I'm not sure how much of a sailor he is, but it's hard to picture Pharaoh being rowed across the Atlantic in a boat without a sail. No pegs or nails were used in its construction. It's held together with ropes. It is, as West puts it, in effect sewn together, which may have something to do with its symbolic identification with unity. There's a practical side to this too, though. The ropes, when wet, shrink, and they would thereby tighten the joints. That rope was included in the kit certainly seems to suggest that it was expected that this boat would be put back together in some way, somehow, sometime, by someone other than an archaeologist, but it didn't happen. This is the second of the Giza pyramids, and it was built for Khufu's son Cafre, apparently. Sloping up at an angle of 54 degrees, it is the steepest pyramid, and it's only slightly smaller than Khufu's. Like all the other pyramids but Khufu's, it's solid, without any apparent chambers up in the body of the pyramid itself. The burial chamber is at the center of the base. It's worth pointing out that the broken lid of the sarcophagus is still in the burial chamber, but that there's no trace of the body. West says pointedly that many people don't feel comfortable in the burial chamber here, but since it's an airless, pitch-black, dark underground tomb, that's not surprising. This is a closer view of it now. There are not only some casing stones still in place here at the top of the pyramid, but at the base, where they were apparently buried in sand and unnoticed by medieval stone quarriers. The odd thing is that the ones at the top are white Tura limestone and the ones at the bottom are gray granite. which makes it seem as though it must have been a kind of two-tone pyramid. Among all the questions surrounding the pyramids, the most basic is just, why did the Egyptians choose this shape? It's been suggested that it may be derived, for example, from the way the sun's rays slant down through the clouds at dawn or sunset, or that it's simply the most stable shape. In the 60s, a lot of attention was focused on the supposed magical quality of the shape. People claimed, for example, that stuff like yogurt put in pyramid-shaped containers wouldn't spoil. And the long life of the Dodge Slant 6 engine was said to be due to the fact that its pistons go up and down at the same angle as that at which the Great Pyramid sides go up. I'm not sure about this, but I did own a used Dodge Dart with that engine for 15 years, and when I finally gave it away, it had over 200,000 miles on it, about half of which I'd driven, and I'd only changed the oil maybe 5 or 6 times, and never done anything as expensive as getting it tuned up. But beware of trusting anecdotal evidence, and I wouldn't eat any 15-year-old yogurt even out of a pyramid-shaped container. This is the Valley Temple of Cafre, one of the surviving parts of the whole temple complex built in connection with his pyramid, and despite its apparent plainness, just basic post and lintel construction, it is about as mysterious as anything in the area. The massive blocks, the vertical ones are about 15 feet high, are in the 100-ton range, and how the Egyptians maneuvered them into position is, again, hard to imagine. There are also many refinements in the way the walls here are constructed.
At the corners, the stones are cut and positioned in a kind of wraparound fashion, a thing that would have been more difficult to pull off than it might seem at first glance. It's possible, I suppose, that this kind of construction was also meant to enhance the unity of the project.
Here in the 19th century, the French discovered one of the most impressive surviving works of Egyptian sculpture, the Diorite statue of Cafre, now in the Cairo Museum. It was found upside down in a kind of shaft, and Mariette, the archaeologist who found it, thought it had been intentionally buried that way for some unknown reason. Diorite is about the hardest stone any sculptor has ever attempted to carve, and the Egyptians did this without even any iron or steel chisels or files as far as we can tell. Again, though, it's not as though it would have been easy to do this work even with the finest 20th century steel. I hope Mariette was wrong in thinking the Egyptians buried this upside down. If he's right, well, we're just really far still from understanding a lot about the way the Egyptians regarded things like this. Here it is closer up and more dramatically lit. Kenneth Clark calls it the most impressive effigy of a ruler ever carved. This is just the attitude every ruler wants to project, I think. He looks serene and powerful at the same time, sort of like Buddha. No ruler wants to look worried or vulnerable, of course. There's just a hint of a smile in the features, and this shows up in other works of Egyptian sculpture as well. It may be, considering the influence Egyptian art had on the Greeks, that this is the ancestor of what's called the archaic smile in 6th century BC Greek sculpture. On the side of the throne, you can see one of the commonest symbols in Egyptian decoration, a stylized papyrus representing Lower Egypt, intertwined with a stylized lotus or blue water lily representing Upper Egypt. They're sort of wrapped around what looks like another lotus with a sort of bulb at the base, and this sort of looks a bit like the River Nile with the delta at the bottom, some think. We have then perhaps the Nile as the binding force uniting Upper and Lower Egypt. It's also been pointed out that this symbol looks vaguely like a stylized human thorax, with the center stalk as the windpipe, the bulb as the heart at the bottom, and the plants on either side as the lungs. This is the Sphinx now, which was apparently meant to serve as part of the whole pyramid and temple project of Cafre. And it may be that it is supposed to have his features. The Egyptian sphinxes have a lion's body and a man's head and seem to have been used typically as sort of gatekeepers or something like stone watchdogs. It's worth pointing out, however, that no other pyramid or pyramid temple complex has one. Herodotus doesn't mention the Sphinx, probably because it was either mostly buried in the sand or because it was still surrounded by other things and didn't stand out the way it does now. As you can probably tell from this picture, it's well downhill from the plateau where the pyramids are, and it has probably been at least partially covered in sand since late antiquity at least. A stele of Thutmose IV records that he cleared away the sand from the monument of his illustrious predecessor Cafre, and this was all the way back in 1400 BC. When the French saw it during Napoleon's occupation in 1800, it was buried up to its chin. Here you see it up more closely now. John Anthony West has recently brought down the wrath of most of the professional community of Egyptologists by claiming that the Sphinx is in fact something like 10,000 years earlier than Cafre's day. His case rests to a large extent on the character of the erosion and weathering it has endured, but Mark Lehner and Zai Awas and the other academic big guns don't buy this view at all, so I don't either. West even went so far as to hire a forensic artist from the NYPD to try to prove that the face on the Sphinx can't be the same as the face on the Cafre diorite. But so what if it's not? That hardly proves it's the work of a hitherto unknown civilization of which we have no other record that supposedly flourished in Egypt 10,000 years ago. Here's the face up more closely. Lehner has also discovered some very interesting connections between the Sphinx and the sun that fit in with the rising importance of the sun in Egyptian tradition in the 4th dynasty, and these finds make West's view seem even less defensible. For West to be right on his view of the Sphinx and about many other things, though, too many other people would have to be wrong. For what he says to be true, too much else would have to be false.
Over the years, people have wondered what the Sphinx is looking at in such a focused way. But if you come around behind it, you can see pretty clearly there off in the distance what may now be the object of his attention. Even John Anthony West didn't notice this amazing connection.
The last of the 3 big pyramids at Giza is that of Menkaure, successor to Cafre. The usual view is that it was smaller and in fact left unfinished because Pharaoh had less money to start with and then ran out of what he had. That's not implausible, but some think it was left unfinished on purpose to allow more than one generation to take responsibility for it. There are a lot of Egyptian building projects which did stretch over centuries, certainly, but how much of this kind of thing was planned is pretty hard to say now. Menkaure and 2 goddesses are depicted in this work in the Cairo Museum. The goddess on the left is Hathor, who shows up frequently in Egyptian art, but the goddess on the right is otherwise unknown. She's referred to simply as the jackal goddess because of the jackal on her headdress, which you may not be able to see very well in this picture. It's rare in the history of art for a ruler like Menkaure to be shown in such a way that it appears he's being protected by women. Their arms reach around his back. Here you can see him with his wife in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. It's true that the other women are goddesses and not just ordinary women, but in this image, as I say, Menkaure is with his wife and her arms around him, and this really is unusual. We never see Henry VIII with Anne Boleyn's arm around him, or Louis XIV with Madame de Maintenon's arm around him. It may be that there's something about this kind of thing that we just don't understand, but prima facie, it looks like more evidence to support the claim that women in Egypt were more prominent than in other ancient civilizations. pharaohs built pyramids right through the end of the 6th dynasty, but few of the later examples are as memorable as the 4th dynasty ones we've been seeing. These at Abu Sir or Saqqara, really Abu Sir is just the Arabic name for Saqqara, but they're sometimes identified as two separate places next to one another on maps. Anyway, these there were basically just mounds of rubble faced over with limestone, and when the latter was removed, there was nothing left but a pile of dirt. Some of the pyramids in this later period, though, are interesting, even if not as architectural or artistic specimens. And we'll go on here at Abu Sir after the break then